trisomies. Sometimes too many chromosomes move away, and they're actually removal of entire chromosomes, meaning both strands, so that you have chromosomal deletions. And in that case, typically fertilization won't occur, but there are instances in which fertilization will occur. So a woman will get a positive pregnancy test, her periods will stop, and the couple will think that they're advancing along the steps to a successful pregnancy, and then there will be, sadly, a miscarriage. Many, many times those miscarriages are the consequence of the fact that when there are extra chromosomes there, or there are too few chromosomes present, that embryogenesis can simply not progress in a healthy way. There are some instances in which all of the chromosomes and all the chromosomal arrangements are perfectly normal, and miscarriages can still occur. I'm going to do a future episode about pregnancy and embryonic development where we will get into this more deeply, but just understand that the frequency of miscarriages increases dramatically after about age 34, and then continues to increase dramatically, extending well out until the 40s. Now, a very important consideration in terms of understanding and predicting fertility and fecundability, this word that describes the probability of getting pregnant on a given try and over time, is trying to address how quote-unquote fertile a woman is, and importantly, how quote-unquote fertile a male is. Now, we'll talk about the male side in a moment, but when trying to address how fertile a woman is, of course, age is going to be one of the major factors, but just one factor, right? We already talked about how age determines the likelihood of a successful pregnancy if the intercourse and ejaculation is being carried out at the correct times and with viable sperm capable of fertilizing eggs. And then, of course, there's the issue of egg quality. But in general, most women would like to know how fertile they are as a function of their age, right? And I actually think this is one of the most important topics in this whole space around fertility that isn't often discussed, or at least isn't often discussed until women are in their late 30s or 40s, when oftentimes they will look back and wish that either they had frozen their eggs or they had frozen fertilized embryos, which is a whole thing unto itself. And we talk about that when we have an episode on in vitro fertilization in more depth. But there is a fairly straightforward way or set of ways that women can determine their basic level of fertility. Leaving aside a lot of the detailed issues about the quality of eggs and so forth, one thing that you already learned is that there's this vault, there's this reserve that we call the ovarian reserve, and that each month a certain number of follicles leave that reserve, and there's the opportunity, based on the ovulation of a single egg, to fertilize that egg and for the woman to get pregnant. Now, one thing that we know for sure is that the size of the population that's released from that vault each month has a very strong positive correlation with the size of the reserve in the vault itself. Okay, so the way to think about this perhaps is that the vault is like a bank account, has a certain amount of money, or in this case, eggs in it. And you could imagine, if someone's reasonably logical, that if they have more money in their bank account, then they're going to withdraw a larger amount each month than if they have a small amount each month, if the idea is to make that vault, that bank of eggs, available to them over the longest period of time. And indeed, biology is pretty smart. It doesn't deploy or release, half the follicles in 1 month and then just slowly trickle out the remainder of follicles. No, that's not how it works. What you find is that, of course, in younger women, so say in their late teens, 20s, and 30s, the ovarian reserve in the vault is going to have more eggs in it, and the number of follicles and eggs that leave that vault each month is going to be quite high. So one way to evaluate how quote-unquote fertile you are, again, just one way, is to go to your OBGYN and say that you would like to know how many follicles you have in a given month. And of course, they'll look at them on both sides in both ovaries. And for instance, if a woman has just 2 or 3 follicles that are out each month, well, then the assumption, again, it's just an assumption, but the assumption that's pretty good, because there's this positive correlation that generally occurs, is that ovarian reserve, that the number of eggs in the vault is fairly low compared to someone who, say, has 20 follicles or 30 follicles each month. Okay, and that's the typical trend. Again, these are averages. And it's very important to not get attached to any one number here. Again, these are averages. So for instance, there are women who only deploy 5 follicles and eggs each month out of their ovarian vault, but who find themselves to be very fertile, right? And there could be a number of different factors to explain that. Other women will have 20 or 30 eggs and follicles that leave that vault, the ovarian reserve, each month, and they will have a harder time getting pregnant for any number of different reasons. But in general, the more eggs and follicles that leave the vault each month, the higher number of eggs that are still in reserve, meaning the greater amount of time over which a given woman could still attempt to have successful fertilizations. Now, this small collection of follicles and eggs that are released each month actually has a name. They're called antral follicles. These are small follicles. They tend to be about 2 to 9 millimeters across. The way these are analyzed or measured is women will go into the OBGYN office, and by ultrasound, typically there's some local anesthesia, but it's not often a general anesthesia, but by local anesthesia, or sometimes no anesthesia, they will essentially count the number of follicles that are present in each side, on the ovary on the left and the ovary on the right, and give a woman some sense of how many follicles she has. And typically this is done over a series of months to determine how many eggs are leaving the ovarian reserve each month, and therefore how many eggs she is likely to still have in the ovarian reserve. Now, there's a non-invasive way to do this as well, although typically an OBGYN will do both what I just described with ultrasound and measure something called AMH, which is anti-Mullerian hormone, which is a hormone that is released by that antral follicle population, the population of follicles and eggs that leave the ovarian reserve each month. So one is a blood draw measure of a hormone, AMH. The other is a structural imaging measure of the antral follicles directly. Again, the typical trend is for the number of antral follicles to decline over time. So one might expect, for instance, that a woman in her 20s or 30s might have 20, 30, maybe even 40 antral follicles that are exiting the reserve each month. And again, that's the total across both ovaries. Again, these are just averages. These are going to be distributions. There will be people with far fewer. There will be people with far more. But that over time, regardless of where a woman starts out, from one decade to the next half decade and decade and so on, that the number of antral follicles will decline and the amount of, or the levels of AMH will also decline. So what does this all mean? What this means is that if you are a woman who is in her 20s or 30s or 40s, whatever your age, if you are interested in conceiving in the future, it's very likely a good idea to go to your OBGYN and get either your AMH levels measured or your follicle count measured, and to do that several times in a given period. And I don't mean a menstrual period, I mean a given period of time across several months to determine what is the average number of follicles, what's your average AMH level, thereby giving you some window into how many eggs you are likely to still have in your ovarian reserve. I cannot tell you how many women that I've spoken to and how many OBGYNs, more importantly, because they speak to many more women about this than I ever have or ever will, wish that they had done this earlier, right? They think, oh, well, I'm in my 20s, so I'm likely to have a ton of follicles, or they got pregnant once before, and so they're not so concerned about the number of follicles or their AMH levels. But over and over again, I was told in researching for this episode that the earlier and more frequent that women do this procedure of measuring AMH and measuring their follicle count, the higher the probability that they will eventually have a successful fertilization and pregnancy when they seek to do so. Now, the mirror image of all this, of course, is the sperm. And, there's a kind of common misconception out there that, the sperm, you only need one, and indeed, you only need one, but actually you need many, and it's only one that's able to successfully fertilize the egg. So this whole concept of you only need one is both dismissive of the sperm, but more importantly, dismissive of the biology of the sperm and the egg. Okay, it only takes one successful sperm and one successful egg, but that's sort of like telling a woman, hey, you only need one egg, right? You need one egg of sufficient quality in the right time and place, and you need one sperm of sufficient quality in the right time and place in order to get successful fertilization and hopefully pregnancy. But you need a lot of sperm in order to get a high probability that that one sperm will be able to successfully fertilize the egg. So we have this image of sperm as kind of these dumb operators that just sort of swim mindlessly towards anything. And if they bump into an egg, then they fertilize the egg. And that's really not the way it works. As I talked about earlier, the sperm with its head, its midregion, and its tail, chock-a-block with mitochondria in the midregion, is really an active motile cell that indeed will just swim forward if it's a healthy forward progressing sperm. But many males out there just simply do not have any knowledge